Welcome to the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast. I'm Eva Monheim.
And I'm Hal Rosner. We are both certified arborists through the International Society of Arboriculture. The purpose of our podcast is to encourage tree planting and proper tree care for our urban forests, which include neighborhoods, parks, and other open spaces.
We will also cover a myriad of tree topics, including the important role trees play in relationship to the climate crisis. Thank you for joining us. The Andalusia Garden Symposium returns to Andalusia Historic House, Gardens, and Arboretum on Thursday, May 1st, with 4 amazing guest speakers: Joe Thompson, Kelly D. Norris, Asa Gregors-Warg, and Charlotte Harris. This year, this inspiring all-day event will be held entirely on the picturesque grounds of Andalusia. Don't miss your chance to hear from some of the most influential and innovative voices in horticulture and gardening. Landscape architects in Pennsylvania can receive 4 continuing education credits by attending. Purchase your tickets today at andalusiapa.org.
Verdant Earth Educators provides dynamic in-person training and online learning opportunities for environmental and horticultural businesses. Owned by ISA-certified arborists and former university faculty, the Verdant Earth Educator team provides consultations on tree care and recommends climate-resilient opportunities for your valued green spaces. Verdant Earth Educators is all about seeding knowledge for success. Find Verdant Earth Educators at verdanteartheducators.com.
Monheim Microphones designs and handcrafts top-tier studio microphones and preamps right here in the United States in Hollywood, California. Their incredible line of innovative microphones and designs are used around the world by everyone from podcasters to top-charting record producers and singers. Monheim Microphones, unparalleled excellence. MonheimMicrophones.com. The Urban Wood Network gives people strength in numbers and a collective voice to showcase the growing environmental impact of an industry like urban wood utilization. This is really critical in a world where resource recovery and carbon storage benefits can go a long way to meet the needs of climate sustainability goals of cities, businesses, and consumers. Contact us at urbanwoodnetwork.org. This podcast is being recorded on January 3rd, 2025. Della Fetzer is a biologist and entrepreneur. Her company, Rebel Cultures, partners with foresters, farmers, conservationists, greenhouses, and universities to develop low-cost and biodiversity-conscious propagation solutions for seed-scarce plants and plants that can't be efficiently propagated from seed by using new approaches to tissue culture. Welcome to the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast, Della. We're delighted that you could be with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Eva.
I was going through some things online, and I know the name Fetzer very well because we used to have a greenhouse. They were one of the very big orchid growers here in the Philadelphia area. I don't know whether you're related to them or not, but the Fetzers were always cutting edge when it came to orchids and plants. And when I saw their name and I was looking up to see how big their operation was and everything, I saw your name and I started reading this information about you. And I was like, oh my goodness, she does tissue culture. This is somebody we need to have on our podcast. And the rest is history. We made connection. And Hal and I are both certified arborists. We love to propagate. We love the whole horticultural industry. I mean, we love all the aspects of it. There's so many different aspects. And having you talk about tissue culture today is going to be really exciting. Hal, do you want to chime in here?
Yeah, good morning again, and thanks for joining us, Della. We'd love to hear a little bit about your background, kind of move us into the conversation, or at least an overview of what tissue culture is. I'll admit I'm, 90% in the dark about it, so have at it.
Thanks so much again for having me. It's awesome to be here. Just been great energy. Love talking to plant propagation people as well as tree people. There's always just so many good vibes. So happy to be here and contribute to that today. So my grandmother was a master gardener on the Fetzer side, but we don't have any relation to that orchid company. But it's funny that the name does have a reputation. So I'm always happy to be accidentally associated with good things, of course. So tissue culture is something that I've learned that a lot of people sort of stumble into. And that was the same for myself for getting into the industry. I had studied biology, gone to school for that, and I sort of ended up accidentally studying plant biology more than animal biology. That was the original plan. But I ended up doing some graduate research at China Agriculture University and then sort of accidentally, swearing off plants after a couple of plant-related jobs weren't exactly the right fit at that time in my life. And I found myself in a career working in a lab, not really working with plants and just feeling like something was missing. So I ended up going back to the green industry, found the first job who would hire me at a greenhouse, doing a little bit of supervision, managing some greenhouse production. And there was this serendipitous opportunity that came up at that commercial greenhouse for a new tissue culture lab director. So I was able to, summon all of my plant biology and really had some exceptionally knowledgeable mentors and training, and was able to get up to speed and join that lab team and learn alongside everybody there. And we were able to really take process improvement really seriously. And in the green industry, you guys know, anyone in it knows that margins are always a big problem. Just getting enough margin on any kind of product can be really challenging. And that remains true for something technical like tissue culture, where there's all of these surgical procedures that the end customer doesn't even have any knowledge or comprehension of that is actually required to go into the project. So we improved every process we could to the extent that we could, but there were just these huge sort of inescapable costs. And the biggest one that I was able to identify in that time was in sort of doing this root cause analysis of where we were spending all of this money, was that roughly 80% of all our operational costs, not to mention roughly 100% of our capital costs, and, if we were to build a new laboratory and source new equipment, but of just the operating costs, roughly 80% could be attributed just to cleaning and maintaining an aseptic, sort of sterile adjacent conditions in plant tissue culture. So I was like, holy smokes, if that doesn't make you just take a step back and say, what are we even doing? Then I don't know what would. So at that point, I think my mind was just sort of frantically searching for anyone in any industry who might have a clue as to how we could eliminate this huge cost in tissue culture while maintaining this really interesting way to propagate plants without needing seed, which, we have some seed shortages with lots of different plants, and while maintaining really high quality and high rooting success rates and all of these benefits that tissue culture has. So that was sort of the reason for the conception of Rebel Cultures. And now 3 years in, we are making some progress toward cutting some of those costs while working on some traditional tissue culture methods in the meantime to really learn the protocols so that we can adapt them and remove some of those costs.
Maybe a lot of people don't know that we are in a really serious crisis, and you alluded to that. Not having enough seed for all the planting that needs to be done, for reforestation, for ground covers, for anything to cover the land so that we're not losing soil and we're actually storing water. And that is quite alarming when you find out that we don't have enough seed. And then we have something like tissue culture where we could take one seed and make 100 plants without any problem. And I'm familiar with the techniques because of my friend, Dr. Mark Bridgen, who works at Cornell on Long Island, and his techniques and how he was able to bring plants from Chile that did not have seed. They couldn't produce seed because they were infertile. And we do this with humans, and we do it with plants. And I don't think people they don't like to equate humans and plants because we don't like, how could we be related? But we are related. And what happens in the people world happens in the plant world, and vice versa. What happens in the plant world happens in the people world. And what you're doing is incredibly important for, I want to say, our survival for the future.
I agree. I think so too.
And whatever techniques you discover is going to be groundbreaking.
So again, me being innocent and naive about it, you had mentioned tissue culture is surgical. So that indicates to me sterility. I guess you're fighting pathogens, the classic ones, fungal, etc. But if a prospective client is frustrated, say on the East Coast, with propagating some type of oak and they reach out to you, what does that look like, Della? Are they sending you overnight cuttings from this oak and say, Rebel Cultures, have at it, say, help me get a couple hundred seedlings back from you, something like that?
It certainly can look like that. And one of our longest standing clients is actually having us work on some oak trees right now. So it really depends on how specific the plant is that a client might want to produce. So the way that we work with a lot of clients is many clients want a production source that they can actually reliably count on and even do themselves. So we are sort of that stopgap measure where we will take cuttings in an overnight bag and we will basically sacrifice them to R&D. Some will survive, many will not. And we are going to try as many different formulations as we can, sort of reasonably for that client. And then we're going to say, okay, here's what's working. Here's what we think we can either deliver or we can continue and develop this process for them, ideally in this new system that we're developing that's actually cutting out that 80% operating costs just to maintain those aseptic conditions.
Right.
And then we can sort of continue along R&D that way. So in the short term, we can deliver formulations for how to do this propagation in tissue culture or small batches of tissue culture. And then in the long term, we can develop essentially this system where I sort of lovingly refer to it as the washing machine version of plant tissue culture, where instead of having a laminar flow hood and surgical tools, you have a cutting board and this machine that sort of like rinses and nutrifies your plants so that they can perform that tissue culture process without you needing to be super technical.
So the client that sent you the oak cuttings, in a couple of years, are you shipping back to them with propagated plants? Is that what that's looking like?
It can look like that, yes.
Okay.
So we've got a client who we're doing Dahlia production for.
Oh, okay.
We just initiated those plants into the lab this last fall. We already have hundreds on the shelf that could ship, tomorrow or in a couple of weeks once we switch over the hormones from the bulking hormones to the rooting hormones. So for the herbaceous plants, it can happen quite quickly. For trees, some of them are fast, some of them are not. Oak has been one that's been a little challenging. We have had success with sequoia and redwood and maple, and we're still experimenting with things like oak and basswood and sassafras right now.
That's really interesting because sometimes the seed will take years and years before it actually propagates or puts out a radical because it has so many dormancies. And can you avoid the dormancy by the timing of when you get the seed or the cuttings? So, well, I'm thinking of seed, like if you can get a seed before it goes into that initial dormancy, can you get material from that and propagate that more quickly?
A lot of times the most vigorous tissue that does well in tissue culture is that sort of rapidly dividing plant tissue. Think in the springtime, the branch tips, where you have that new green growth and you can almost day by day see how quickly it's growing. That often translates to fast growth in tissue culture as well. So that sort of breaking dormancy time is ideal. However, if there are, say, stock plants in a greenhouse where maybe they're not fully dormant, we can bring them out of dormancy sometimes, or sometimes we can, do a short stratification on seeds. We're doing this right now with some red pine seeds that we just got in yesterday.
I know I use some biochar for fire species. Do you ever experiment with that, on the auger using biochar? Especially for fire species, which would have that chemical in it that they need to help promote the growth of that particular plant, because there's so many plants out there that have specific chemicals that are in their environment that actually trigger their growth.
Yeah, and so many of those are living as well, different bacteria or mycorrhizal sort of stuff.
Right.
Mycorrhizae and, all of their friends. So the activated charcoal is something that commonly goes into our plant growth media to address that question. And then there are so many microorganisms that are beneficial to growth that can't currently be used in plant tissue culture, simply because the culture medium is sterilized before the plant goes on it. So it would kill any sort of beneficial microbe inside. And that's another key difference with what we're developing, is that we can actually in tandem dose beneficial microbes and plant growth media. And we can do that without actually infecting the plant.
The first thing that shot through my head when you were talking about that is some of the mosses, like the sphagnum mosses and the mosses that have very low or they have very high sterility, or there's a lot of sterile content when you're thinking about them, that maybe they could be some type of growth medium where you could put plant on that can just give that little bit of a trigger to get that cell to divide. I think it's really fascinating. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, the possibilities are a bit overwhelming, but mostly exciting.
I know Hal and I have been talking about this topic and how excited we are to have you on, because there's just so much that we don't know about what you do. Do the clients typically come to you, or do you reach out to clients? How does that work?
Sure. We have reached out to clients, and in the past year or so, we've had more clients and just network contacts reach out to us. We've met quite a few people through trade shows and through different talks and panels that I've been able to be part of. And definitely through podcasts like this as well. Our work with universities is helpful. Like this past fall, I went to a controlled environment ag conference in Virginia, and the host there, turns out that they might actually be a great partner for us, and they might be able to connect us with other clients that they work with in their area. So it's really through sort of these expanding networks that we're finding the most meaningful projects to us at this point.
When you were talking about controlled environment, is that like a phytotron building where everything's controlled inside?
It's like vertical farms.
Oh, vertical farms.
Oh.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Because I've seen phytotrons down in North Carolina, and I thought they were really cool.
Eva.
Yeah.
It's baby spinach, but that's probably always going to be a seed crop, the lettuce.
Yeah.
So we're talking about strawberries and some of those specialty things like the new squashes or melons that are being bred for being grown indoors. There are some school programs where we can work with them to grow things like, native pollinator species, things that you might not be able to source seed for is sort of our specialty.
Wow.
So the future has officially arrived. Thank you.
Well, we're all part of it, right?
I think you just have to have an open mind when you do what you do.
Right.
You don't want to close anything down, because what you might close might be the door that opens everything.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Just so marvelous that people like yourself are doing what you're doing, because you're changing the industry for the better and also for preservation.
That's what motivates our team the most, is not the super high volume products, just doing a bunch of pretty but invasive plants for a garden, it really wouldn't get the team excited. But getting to help conserve something or bring a totally new product online or establish a seed block of something where there wasn't seeds before, those are the kinds of projects that are really meaningful and are on our dream project list.
And of course, we always hear throughout any given year, some historic tree blowing down, uprooting and stuff. Have you been involved with any projects to keep the legacy of a specific historic tree continuing into the next century through tissue culture?
Yeah, absolutely. We have been very lucky to work with Archangel Ancient Tree Archive.
Oh, yeah.
In Copamish, Michigan.
Yes.
And that's their thing, is preserving the champion trees, the oldest, most experienced trees. And
fantastic.
Some of them are just stumps even that are shooting new branches up. So some of those trees are, many years past. We've got a 4,000-year-old sequoia tree just growing in a little test tube. And It's definitely makes you feel some type of way.
Yeah, I remember now, Archangel was pretty engaged with some stuff here on the West Coast. I don't remember the specifics, right? We've learned over the past few years, about that shadowy, sinister world of seed collecting and, keep it under wraps where that favorite tree is when you're going out to collect. And then sometimes it's much more altruistic in terms of heading to Arizona or Mexico to collect acorns, in a specific region. But I'm wondering, what's your sense of a timeline? Is tissue culture faster than traditional seed production?
I would say that depends on whether or not you already have the seed and what time of year it is.
Yeah.
So tissue culture has the benefit of being far less seasonal than traditional seed collected crop might be. So let's say that you need 10,000 Douglas fir ASAP. If you have the seed for that right now and you can start stratifying it and then germinating it right away, and you've got the greenhouse capacity and all of the supplies, that might be faster. So the advantage to tissue culture then is if you don't have the seed, but you do have the protocol developed, you can get, 120 branch cuttings. And if you have those plants established in tissue culture, you just sort of have like a backup bank that you can pull from anytime. You can go from 120 plants to 10,000 in 4 months if conditions are right. So you can go to, a plantable, few inches high, rooted plant that can go into your tray and be grown out in a greenhouse.
Yeah, it's funny. Even as I asked that question, Della, I thought, here's another human, trying to speed things up and, meet our obligations and our frenzied deadlines. And it's like, relax, human. It's all going to work out. Don't ask so much of your trees.
It's a good stopgap measure because, not everything happens exactly at the right season.
Sure. Right.
So, like you said, if the tree isn't producing seeds anymore, it's going to be way faster than waiting indefinitely.
Yeah.
Or if it blows down and it can't produce seeds, or, the seed isn't available, or it's needed more somewhere else. There are absolutely ways where tissue culture is an advantage. The thing that is the biggest disadvantage is just the cost. So if you're used to a seed costing a cent or a fraction of a cent, traditionally produced tissue culture, especially in a domestic lab, might cost 75 cents or even up to dollars for a tissue culture plant. And that's not something that the industry is used to.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, the other thing too, and you were alluding to trees that don't produce seed, we have some plants that there's only females left, or especially when they're not trees. And I'm thinking of a cycad that, I had a student working with it at Longwood Gardens, and that cycad is there's no female. They're all males. So in that case, either inciting the plant to push out a pup or it's tissue culture. And you don't want to see something disappear from the face of the earth.
Right.
And at the same time, you also want to be thoughtful in how you manage these plants that might be very limited. So I would imagine that that's something too that you think about when you're working and mass producing something. And I was thinking of, oak trees, because they might not have a mast year for maybe 5-10 years. They may only have a couple, and most of the time they're not viable. Well, what do you do? Or a pine tree that has a problem, or especially I was thinking about the pine bark beetle that is devastating so many pine trees that they can't produce seed, and they might lose a whole grouping of trees to an insect, like we did with our ashes. And, that's where I think tissue culture is really critical for saving something that we could lose.
Absolutely, especially if there are those individuals in a population, and the more the better, who have displayed resistance or really important traits like rust resistant or, emerald ash borer resistant, where we can quickly is general, of course, because the tree is not going to be mature in a year. We can select individuals that have those traits that will help to strengthen the landscape and to replace the trees that are damaged by these disease and insect outbreaks. And we can use these species that have shown resistance, or these individuals, and we can propagate them using tissue culture. Right. To create a seed block of disease-resistant trees or insect-resistant trees, or to at least have a backup to reforest or repopulate the landscape after these devastating events.
I was just reading an article about someone who was in an area where the ash were all killed off, and this woman was walking along and she saw one tree standing there like nothing happened around it, And there's a case in point where you have a tree that is obviously showing complete resistance to this insect, and you don't want that to die because you can propagate from that. And that is your next layer of security for that particular species. And again, ash are male and female, so you don't know whether it's a male, female. What do you do? I mean, those are all the things I think about when people are propagating, or when you talk about tissue culture. How much it can actually mean to a whole community, plant community.
Yes, absolutely. And with preserving diversity too, because that's the biggest criticism of tissue culture, and it's a totally fair one, is you don't want a monocrop in a landscape, because that landscape is not going to be healthy. You can't possibly predict what those individuals need to be resistant against. So catching a declining population when there's more than one left is very important. And then collecting from as many as possible is something that we are very mindful to do. So a colleague reached out who said, hey, there might be this program where we are going to try to preserve this native thistle, and we know of 200 left in the state. Well, instead of just collecting nodes from a few, why wouldn't we try to get 100 or all 200, or as many of them that looked healthy as we could, to create a new batch from that?
A new genetic pool.
Absolutely. You know that genetic variation is going to occur even with plants that are cloned. If you use the broadest collection that you can at the beginning, you're going to have a much broader collection than if you do traditional tissue culture, collection techniques where you're just targeting a plant or two.
Yeah, and I always would tell my students, in woody plants, the term 1 in a million came from plants. Right. Where every millionth plant can be the blip that you're expecting, Mm-hmm. When I was involved with introducing the knockout rose, sure enough, after the first million, there was a blip. And it was a soft pink rose, and it was a sport off of the stem of the shrub. So that to me tells me that there's hope even when you have a cultivar, that you can have blips off of that and still get diversity from that.
Yes.
Yeah.
You had alluded to the cost, Della, per unit, and I get that. And also, thank you for touching on, that monoculture issue and the need for genetic diversity. I'm always scratching my head like, who is the nursery industry? I can't find any big American nurseryman type publication. I'm pretty sure they're long gone. What challenges do you see? What are your hurdles or roadblocks in terms of getting the industry at large to take a look at it? Because the one thing I do know, and I'm not faulting them, is that it's an old industry, right? It's as old as the United States in terms of nurseries coming here and growing trees for the new world. But when you speak to people in the industry, do you have like any meta or major roadblocks that you feel like you're up against?
Well, every industry has its own quirks and strengths.
Well said.
Yes. So, and the age of that industry has a lot to do with how they see new technology as well. So forestry being the oldest industry that we work with, and of course, the biggest problem is that trees and therefore trials on trees take a minimum of 5, maximum of 50 plus years to complete. And when you want to try something new, you have to really prove that you're invested and willing to stick around and willing to trial things maybe for free or for just those really early adopters who want to try something new because they like trying new stuff.
Right.
In the horticulture industry, they're already pretty acclimated to tissue culture. They use it for commercial propagation. A lot of it is outsourced just because of the labor and the cost. Again, mostly just for cleaning and maintaining that aseptic culture. So we are really excited to be able to say, hey, the future might be local propagation for that industry that, nobody likes to have the headache of dealing with shipping delays or customs or international negotiations if there are new tariffs imposed. Nobody likes that job. So that's a really easy thing to say, hey, if the price was comparable, would you be interested in doing it yourself or sourcing it locally? The newer industries like the controlled environment ag industry and certainly the cannabis industry, those have a lot of people who are willing to try things, but the investment and the actual engagement might not actually be backing up the hype that they're bringing to a conversation. So everybody's a little different. And then with conservation, that can really be all over the board. So whether it's like an arboretum who has like their set standards, maybe there is a tree that they want to be able to preserve or propagate for a native plant sale. There's a lot to learn because everybody's so unique so far from what we've seen. And there's a lot of like little commissions sort of running a lot of that work. And everyone's got a different personality. So it's definitely a lot of variation. And, we're going to just keep showing up and learning how to be helpful and coming at it from a value for the planet and for people perspective.
When we're talking about plants and we think about, the orthodox seed and the recalcitrant seed. Recalcitrant seed is one that you actually have to have a plant to propagate from or a seed that has to be planted right away. So tissue culture probably would be much better for something like that where you could store the little plantlets and be able to increase a crop very quickly, especially a lot of the tropical plants in particular that I'm thinking about, where they can fill in very, very rapidly, as opposed to some of our woody plants and things here in the north where you have all these different dormancies. And I think that that's where I see it really blossoming in those areas. And I know some of the big growers have chosen to do tissue culture overseas, not only because of the price, but also to protect their plants. That's another issue where a lot of them choose to have things in different places so that in case something happens in one location, they don't lose everything.
Sure.
So it could be in other parts of the country, for example. But
right.
The idea of now, do you do storage for people? Like, do you do tissue culture storage?
We do some, yes.
And do you see that growing in the future?
Potentially. There are labs who specialize in that. And if a client had a protocol already, then we might just say, hey, we might refer you to a partner who is specialized in that. But if somebody said, hey, like a breeder, for instance, if they had a very specialized plant and they needed to learn how to propagate it, or they didn't have a protocol,
Right.
and they wanted some small scale production and they wanted storage, that would be a lot of R&D for a storage lab to pick up. So we would take on that kind of specialty project and say, hey, this is some R&D, and we can add the storage in there for you.
Got that. That's neat.
On your website, Della, you mentioned early on, I think it's one of the front pages, just the aspect of the nutrients that are delivered.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have to customize each nutrient prescription, or is it kind of a generic that every tissue culture procedure gets, if that's phrased correctly?
Yeah, there is a ton of variation in formulations.
Yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, we've got both strawberries and sequoia trees here on the shelf, and they need different things. And not only that, they need something different when they first enter the lab, and then they need something different when they are sort of bulking and propagating. And then they need something different when they're rooting. And then they need something different when they're just on maintenance and relaxing, hopefully not, growing and dividing too quickly. So all of those things need to be figured out in order to successfully produce and store a plant.
Is it a little bit more than NPK, I'm assuming?
It is. It is. Yeah. Our recipes can be anywhere from 10 to 40 ingredients long.
Oh.
Yeah.
Multiple vitamin.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You just, one a day. You just kind of tuck it in there.
You guys are the next generation of mad scientists in a good way.
It certainly feels like it sometimes, but we find plenty of people who are almost as mad as us. So that keeps it fun and keeps us sane.
Yeah. So with the prescription nutrient program, are you able to, do you need to consider mycorrhizae as part of this, or do you kind of forego that due to the aseptic aspirations?
So we consider that in the traditional tissue culture, because sometimes that means, because the mycorrhizae can, of course, modulate or affect the different organic and inorganic nutrients in the soil in a natural environment. So we look at what that effect is, and we replicate as much of that natural condition as we can in traditional culture. And then we take that information and say, okay, in a perfect world where we could give all of the nutrients the plant needs and maybe the exact mycorrhizae or your compost tea or, whatever it looks like to the plant at the same time, how would we do that? And that's sort of this technology, this system that we're building, is to be able to create that custom nutrient and custom beneficial microbe profile together that work to produce that plant even more efficiently than traditional tissue culture can.
So I would imagine that all that complexity would actually help the plant to grow much quicker once it's in a growing medium, because you've already provided those multiple things to the root system already. I guess then we think about somebody like Lars Jensen, who does the special air pots, where if you have those little seedlings and you put it into something like that, wow, they would take off right away and just, explode.
That's what the research shows over and over again, is that plants that have these beneficial microbes perform better. So why wouldn't that also be true in tissue culture? So not only faster growing, but more resistant is what we're hoping for, because that's a big problem with tissue culture, is you have that acclimatization shock where a plant is used to this totally aseptic, sort of germ-free environment, and then they get ripped out of the incubator and thrown into the real world in their tray in the greenhouse. And if the humidity and temperature and nutrients aren't totally right, then they sort of just give up. And that is really sad to see after all of the work that tissue culture requires. So by having a device where we can sort of get the plant ready for its life after tissue culture while it's still in tissue culture, I think could be really powerful for growers.
And knock off that time, then it also balance out the expense of everything.
Yes.
So that you can have a crop, instead of maybe having a crop twice a year, you have 3 times a year, or instead of once every 2 years, you have one every year. And it makes a huge difference when you're looking at dollars and cents.
Absolutely.
Well, where do you see what you're doing going in the future? Like, where do you see your company and its vision?
That's a really beautiful question. Thank you for asking that. I sort of fell in love with plants and propagation and forestry and agriculture sort of all together because of the people who are working in it. And I was really just shocked over and over again how dedicated people were to their work, even if they were having trouble paying their bills or affording, some basic life things, just because they couldn't live without doing this work. They just had to do it.
Yeah.
And there's no other industry that is more essential for human survival. And you have these people who absolutely just their heart bleeds for this work. And that's so inspiring to me. And the thing that's the saddest to me about these industries is how little we can get away with paying people in them. So my dream in all of this is to decrease these costs to the extent that the margins can increase for growers enough that we can create better models for how to pay people in these industries, and that we can actually relocalize a lot of our plant propagation. Because not only do we not give people really cool jobs who want them here when we outsource tissue culture propagation, we risk importing these diseases that are not native to our landscapes and gardens. So if we have the tool to relocalize tissue culture and we have this process that's low cost enough that any nursery or, a nearby nursery can source from a local nursery partner, I just think that the community aspect and the worker aspect and the ecological aspect of plant propagation could just be so much cooler for everyone than it might be without something like what we're developing.
It's interesting that you're saying that. And it kind of takes me back to when I first started in the industry, and horticulture was one of the higher paying industries. And it was because it was very local. Everything was local. The greenhouses, the operations. I mean, you just drive a mile and you came across a huge range of greenhouses, another mile, another huge range. And I tell people this and they're like, what? And I go, yes, Philadelphia region was one of the biggest greenhouse production areas in the world. But it was the oil embargo that did it in. Totally. Everything collapsed. But now we have so many other people being so creative with energy, different types of energy and different types of everything. I mean, everything's coming out all at once. It seems like we've hit this time of another renaissance with plants and with people and medicine and everything. That the renaissance is going to bring back all of what you're talking about. It has to, because we can't go on the way we've been going on. And eventually things do come full circle. I do believe, and that's my own opinion. And I love the way you put it, where, you're creating that local economy again, where people do love what they do and they go to work because they're passionate about it and they feel that they're making a difference for humanity. It's not just being a cog in a big wheel where you can't see what the big wheel looks like because you're just a cog. You actually can see the world.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really critical. And I love the fact that we had you on today, because you're making such big inroads for our industry.
Thank you.
And it's people like you who are passionate, and you have your lab near your home, or you're in your home, or it doesn't get better than that, because you don't have to go far. You're not wasting energy to get to your job. You're doing what you love to do, and you're finding out that there's a lot of things that you can invent and create that you might not otherwise do in another position somewhere.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I concur with Eva, Della. That was a lovely answer in terms of we've all had that experience of meeting so many great people that love the natural world and are sacrificing to a certain extent in terms of wages and financial security. And that does need to continue to be addressed. It's interesting. I mean, you kind of opened our interview this morning talking about margins and then circled back to it at the back end. So I can tell you're definitely a business person as well. And yeah, I mean, that bottom line is not going to go away. Yeah, it has to be, it always has to be front and center for everything else to thrive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we're kind of wrapping things up now, and we always have to ask this question of our guests. And I wanted to find out, do you have a favorite tree or group of trees, or maybe someplace where you used to live or live now, or I don't know. We like to give you options.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I feel very not welled in by that question. I do have a favorite tree because I found so much joy learning about it. This past summer, my teammate Rachel and I went out west and were very lucky and saw some large production greenhouses out there. And one of the places we went was Cal Forest Nurseries.
Mm-hmm.
And we were sort of heading into one of these outbuildings, and there were these enormous pine cones, just bowling ball sized pine cones. And I had never seen a pine cone like this before. I mean, I'd seen the big sugar pine cones, but just like huge rocks. And I just couldn't stop looking at it. And they're like, take it. We've got a whole bunch of them. And
Is it a Coulter pine?
It's a gray pine.
Gray pine.
Yeah, gray pine. So getting it home and comparing the gray pine bowling ball sized cone with the sequoia pine cone, which is quite small. You know, sequoia trees are obviously huge, and this gray pine, you look it up and the far away pictures, it looks kind of spindly, almost like you might confuse it as something that's deciduous. It's like, how does this scrappy little profile of a tree make this bowling ball pine cone, and this like huge, iconic giant of a tree make these tiny little cones? So it feels like a metaphor to me to not judge a tree by its cone.
That's great. That's great. I love that. That kind of reminds me of when the students, I was taking them around for a walk on campus, and we get to the beautiful big willow oak tree. And then I say, okay, take a look to see if you can find the little acorns, and they're so small. They're just so small because smaller beaked birds can eat them.
Wow.
As compared to the big acorns that big birds eat. And they were like, what? Like, they were so tiny, and look how big this tree is. I can't believe that a big tree like this comes out of this tiny little acorn. So yeah, so it's the same thing. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Well, Della, thanks so much for joining us. And it's been fantastic and inspirational to have you on and hear about rebel cultures. Of course, all your links will be on our website, including your TED Talk. So we wish you the very best and hope that we bump into each other out there in the horticulture world.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, and good luck to you and your colleagues.
Thank you guys. Take care, Eva.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Plant a Trillion Trees podcast is edited by Andromedan Recordings in Hollywood, California.